This is my new design, the Spring Blossoms cardigan. It is going in a cardigan book with emphasis on the different types of cardigan bands that I am working on, and you'll see it shortly. And it will probably also appear in Country Knitting of Maine News and Views, maybe in 2020. Both the band and the pockets are slightly unusual, something you may not have done every day. And I'll give you another video on the band, but in this one, we will explore the pockets. Here's one knitted, but as yet unfinished, and we will position it as shown and tidy it up, and it will get finished. Here's the interior, the part in this which you would slip your hands, your keys, and so forth. While knitting the front, we actually just bind off and then cast on again to create the space into which the pocket will be knitted. That leaves an opening like this one. I used the color that will be the welt for the bind off, and you'll see why that matches better in a minute. The bottom edge is the bind off, the top edge is where we cast on anew. Okay, let's make this pocket. This one will give you an idea of where we're going. I've already knitted it, but obviously it's not finished. We'll first hang this area, the area that was bound off to create the opening. We'll knit these pocket rows, rehang the same area. I should have said knit the welt rows. This is the upper hem. This is the part that will show on the outside of the garment. This is the part that will hold your goodies or your hand, and it's a continuation of this after hanging and knitting it. We knit those rows, then hang this upper area, and I like to knit one row before binding off. It's just more convenient. Later, to finish it, we will tidy up, so this, and seam these edges together. So this isn't nearly as hard as you may think it would be. So let's make sure we get this positioned correctly. This is the lower hem of the garment. This is a few inches up, and we want the welt to extend up from that area. So we actually hang the bind off on the machine. The opening for every stitch that was bound off goes on a separate needle. And for this reason, when you're casting on and binding off to make that slit, you do want to make sure that you haven't done it so tightly that the fabric will no longer stretch. On the other hand, I do like it not to be floppy because it helps control the width of the pocket. So hang every stitch that was bound off. Oops, I went into the stitch there and I really just wanted to go behind the bind off. Once the bind off is hung, pick up the piece of fabric right next to it on each side and hang an additional stitch. This will make the welt just a touch wider than the pocket opening and give us a place to sew the welt down to the main fabric to do the finishing. It's very helpful because this is quite soft knitting and we don't want it to droop. What I am using for the hem and the welts is a composite yarn, two thinner strands than the main yarn that add up, in my case, to a slightly heavier composite than the main yarn is. It's okay if they are not heavier, if they add up to be just the same. And because they are heavier and I don't want my hems and welts to flare, I'm knitting them extra tight, which also makes them extra firm. So the numbers that I'm about to give you relate to this method of doing it. And I favor this method because I can make the pocket thinner and less bulky by removing one of the strands, and I'll only knit with the one my finger is on, the larger of the two. You would do something almost identical to this whatever yarns you used, but you might tweak your stitch size. My main stitch size was 5, right there. I'm going to start with stitch size 6 so I can knit off this row that is the extra bulk without making an undue bump or divot in the fabric. And then we'll go down from there. So stitch size 6, knit 1 row. I'm going to reduce the stitch size 1 click on this machine, that's 5.5, and knit row 2, and keep on doing that. 3, 4, 5, 6, and now I am at stitch size 3.5, significantly tighter than the 5 that I was knitting the main knitting at. I believe that's row 6. Let me count up and be sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I'm knitting 16 total. So 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. My goal was to have about an inch long welt, and this gets 7 rows per inch, but because I've tightened the stitch size, I figured I would make it an 8-row long welt, and since it has a lining, that means I'm making double that, so it's 16 rows. Now I'm hanging the same area again, and that will close and finish the welt. So I'm just going to speed myself up as I continue hanging. Wouldn't it be awesome if we could do this in real life? Once this is done, we'll begin knitting the actual fabric of the pocket. And I left the end stitch over here for last because it has a knot on it, and I want to remind myself, this is from where I cast on, to give it some room to operate. That's a whole bunch of stuff on these needles that I want to knit back. So again, I'm going to go up to 6, and I'm going to come up here and break one of the yarns and move it out of the way. I've removed it from the feeder, but I've left this little bit of it, and I'm going to let that knit in on the very first row. So the yarn tail's woven in, and again, counting and reducing. I'm going to stop and reset my row counter to 0 so I don't lose track while yakking with you. Okay, we're good. I actually set it to 1 because I've already knitted 1 row. And I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. Gradually reduce the stitch size. 1 more click. I'm going down to 4. 1 stitch size smaller than I was knitting the main yarn. And now I'm just going to knit to row 60 for this. Of course, the exact amount of rows that you would choose to knit varies with the size of the project, the yarn, the gauge, and all that. Okay, all knitted. This is the bottom. This is where the welt will come up. This will tuck inside the sweater. With that in mind, this top edge is where we want to hang. And again, I'm going to start 1 stitch outside where I can see the last one bound off. And hang across. This is a very simple pocket join, and because we have not turned the work, using this method will mean that we can see this area being hung and the bind off if we look inside the pocket. And I will put on a burst of superhuman speed and get all these stitches hung. Remember to hang 1 stitch beyond the cast on area, just as we did on the other side. I like to knit one row before I bind off, although that's certainly optional. There are a couple of reasons that I like it. I like the reinforcement, but in this case, I also prefer, particularly when on camera, facing the way you're facing now, to do my transfer bind off from left to right. The absence or presence of that row makes very little difference to the ultimate result. So do what you prefer to do and are most comfortable with. Don't get all unduly worried about it. In case you've never seen me do this, here it is up close. All I'm doing is substituting the fingertips on my left hand for an eyelet tool. I'm lifting the stitch off and pinching it so it can't get away and moving it over with my hand rather than the tool. No biggie. And it's not in any way superior. It's just fast and it's easier for me to keep my hand visible to you. Of course, at this point, there are all kinds of yarns that need to be finished and woven in. But let's just tuck the pockets in and envision what it will be like. I'll use some of those yarn tails to neatly stitch this area down and this area down. Same over here. Your pocket will probably look like this, all out of the fabric of the sweater. Tuck it in. Make sure that this area where we hung the welt and the area where we hung the pocket top edge and bound off are positioned so that they touch one another. Use a yarn tail to neatly sew here and here, and of course, sew the edges of the pocket together. Now that wasn't so hard, was it?